Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Cocktails and Politics with American Public Square at Jewell. I'm Alan Katz, the founder of American Public Square at Jewell. And first of all, let me sort of say that since we call this Cocktails and Politics, that I would like to thank the mixologist for the evening, Ian Walla, for creating a special craft cocktail for this evening's event called This Americano Votes. The recipe and photos of Mr. Walla making the drink can be found at americanpublicsquare.org/events. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who made this program possible, including the American Public Square Program Committee, the Membership Committee, and all the staff and volunteers at APS. I also want to thank our sponsors for tonight's program, William Jewell College, Marnie and John Sherman, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, and FlexPod. Tonight's Cocktails and Politics features Senator Sherrod Brown. Senator Brown is the senior senator from the state of Ohio. And the conversation this evening is going to be about a book that he wrote. And he finds himself in the enviable position of being the second author in his family. His wife, Connie Schultz, is a well-known journalist. So he has to sort of take sort of second seat when it comes to fame for his literary achievements. But I think the book tonight will be discussed by our panelists. And I think most importantly, we should keep in mind that Senator Brown started as Secretary of State in the state of Ohio. He went to the Congress and he's been in the United States Senate. His entire career has been built around what he would call fighting for the dignity of work, the belief that hard work should pay off for everyone. As always in American Public Square programming, we welcome questions from the audience. Denisha Snell, APS Program Director, will be your roving reporter for this evening. She's going to be watching for any questions that you may have for our guests. Please feel free to type those into the Q&A section of Zoom. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also ask questions by posting in the comments section. We also are glad to be part of the Kansas City Star's live streaming tonight. And at this point, I want to turn you over to our moderators for the evening, Colleen Nelson and Mike McShane.
Good evening. Thanks so much, Alan. Really looking forward to the conversation tonight. Colleen and I flipped a coin before this, and so I won. So I get to ask the first question, which is exciting. So in your book, Desk 88, eight progressive senators who changed America, it opens with the image of you and your fellow freshman senators kind of wandering around the big hall and deciding where it is that you're going to sit. You eventually end up at Desk 88, which links you to the 8 senators that you profile in this book. But before we get to that, and given the fact that we're about to have an election in a couple weeks, it might be worth starting by just kind of asking the question, what happens after you get elected to the Senate? November 3rd will happen. The next morning you wake up, you find out that you have been victorious. In the book, you mentioned things like attending an orientation. It had an almost kind of junior high feel to it, so I don't know what was going there. But so what, as you're preparing to take your seat in the Senate, what happens in that time period? I think you're muted.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Now we're on. There's an eagerness. I mean, you spend at least a year. It's more like 2 years of your life now running for the Senate. I came to the Senate with nine other freshmen. One of them, Claire McCaskill, who represented most of you in Missouri. And we all are ranked by seniority, based on your service before you got there, and you go through an orientation session, all of that. And then you have a choice of what office to be in, what desk to sit on the floor, and what committees you want to be on. And that's all done by seniority. So by the time we get to the Senate floor and have an orientation about Senate rules, we then pick our desk by seniority. And so we scurried around the floor a little bit like high school, as you said, or middle school, figuring out which desk we're going to sit in. And I realized it doesn't really matter where you're sitting. You're not behind a post at in an old baseball stadium. You're in the Senate. So I heard people sign their desk drawers. So I started pulling out desk drawers of some of the 10. And About the fourth one I opened, it said McGovern, South Dakota, Hugo Black, Alabama, Gore, Tennessee, Albert Gore Sr. And then it said Kennedy with no first name, no state. And Ted Kennedy was seated several seats away. And I asked him later to come over and I said, which brother's desk is this? And he said, well, it's got to be Bobby's because I have Jack's desk. And I guess Ted Kennedy got first choice there. So I just was intrigued by this desk and began to think more about those people that had carved their names on it. My wife ordered, because I think you do your job, whatever it is, whether it's broadcasting, whether it's journalism, whether it's politics, whether it's business. I think you do your job if you know a little bit more about what happened before you got there. And so my wife ordered just bought a bunch online, a bunch of books about the Senate, and I started reading and got this idea to write about these senators that held the desk.
So we have a lot to get to with Senate history and progressive politics, but I did want to ask one other question about this desk selection process, because I think it's something a lot of people don't know anything about. And you're right, it sounds kind of eerily like trying to choose the right lunch table in middle school, which kind of freaks me out. And clearly the desk that you chose, Desk 88, came to mean a lot to you. You've immersed yourself in the history of Desk 88, but I'm interested in whether you ever have had desk selection remorse, whether you ever wished upon further reflection that you had chosen LBJ's old desk, for instance, or you realized that you wish you hadn't ended up sitting so close to Ted Cruz, for instance. I'm just throwing that out there as a for instance. I don't know if you sit near Ted Cruz, but have you ever wished that you had chosen a different desk?
No, I haven't, but I have wished that Hubert Humphrey held my desk, because I would love to have written about Humphrey, because Humphrey probably better than anybody knew how to play inside outside. He was responsible for so many progressive issues. I mean, his career was so blemished by his support of LBJ on the war, and that really did affect the view of Humphrey in history. But he did the inside outside, in that he was very effective inside the Senate, but he also understood how important it was to build support for his progressive initiatives outside the Senate, to put pressure on the Senate. Social media has changed a lot of that in some ways. But in terms of location, my desk is actually moved. I've actually asked to move to a different place when other spaces open up. So now I sit right across from the aisle from the Republican side. And I wrote this in the paperback. The book came out a year ago. The paperback came out a couple months ago, and I wrote a partial chapter on impeachment. And I could sit so closely to the Republicans watching them during impeachment. Well, I know all of them. I know some fairly intimately, most of them not. So, and it was pretty interesting to watch their reactions, I thought, as they sort of meekly stood up in some cases and said not guilty when the articles of impeachment, and when not one of them, with the exception of Mitt Romney, was willing, if I recall, even to vote to allow witnesses. The impeachment trial in the Senate, the Republicans blocked any witnesses from coming in to talk to us, which is talk about gaming the system.
So you profile 8 senators. Could you let the audience know, so who are the 8 senators that you profile, and how did you decide to include those 8?
I didn't have any magic number. It just ended up being 8. The first, the book took 10 years to write. I was obviously focused on my day job, and then in a campaign, I wrote less during different periods. And I thought I was done about halfway through, about 5 years in. I'd written about 8 senators, and I thought I was about done. And for the first time, I showed the whole draft to my wife, who is, as Alan said, she's a Pulitzer winner, as Colleen is. So she is a very accomplished writer. Just came out with her first novel, Daughters of Eerietown, and is really good. And she looked at it and she read it and she said, "You're about half done." I thought I was done, almost done. And that was not a good week for our marriage. But she forced me to go back and say, "Listen, you're going to write about these 8. Any historian can do that, can write about 8 senators. You've got to bring yourself into it, the Senate into it today, and your views." And so I wrote essays about each of the 8. The first one was Hugo Black. He goes back starting in 1926. He has a rather sordid past, but a great civil libertarian later. Glenn Taylor from Idaho, the singing cowboy of Idaho. Herbert Lehman was governor of New York, son and nephew of the founders of the Lehman Brothers. Al Gore Sr., Robert Kennedy, William Bobby Kennedy, William Proxmeyer, senator from Wisconsin, and George McGovern was the only senator I knew of the 8. And McGovern, I left out one. I'm sorry. Theodore Francis Taylor, or Theodore Francis Green from Rhode Island, was a New Deal governor that came to the Senate at the age of 69 as a freshman. And he was a pretty interesting guy too, a very wealthy family that never had much luck in elective politics until he did. But McGovern, as I said, was the only one I knew. I got to know McGovern pretty well in the last 10 years of his life. And he was the one that was and I worked in McGovern's campaign as a college student, so it was kind of a full circle there. So that made it easy to choose him. Some of the others, like Glenn Taylor, probably nobody on this call has heard of. I didn't know who he was. There's not a lot written about him, but he was the most challenging and in many ways the most fun to write about.
So we'll dive into the individual senators, I'm sure, because there are lots of stories to talk about. But just to kind of talk about what binds them together for a minute, it's really interesting to read about these progressive senators from different time periods wrestling with different issues, different political pressures. And you say in the book that they're all bound together by a revulsion at injustice and a respect for the dignity of work. And I wondered if you could talk for a minute about just kind of the most important connective tissue that you think brings these 8 senators together, and also in what important ways they diverge.
Yeah, they diverge in terms. That's a really good question, Colleen. They diverge. They come from very, as you point out, very different regions of the country. Idaho versus New York versus Wisconsin, all different regions of the country. They share, as I think all progressives do, an aversion to private concentrated power. That and implicit in that is standing up for I'd say the little guy, but that sounds something. I mean, it sounds a bit sexist today, but standing up for the little guy in that way. They all were white men. Make that clear. The only people, with one exception, the senator from Hawaii, they were all white men that sat at this desk. They all. I would assume that when I leave the Senate, there's a good chance the next person that has this will be female, as more women get elected to the Senate, at least on the Democratic side. But they diverge, and some of them were consistently from the beginning progressive. Others of them started off in a bit of a dark place, and I would say, I mean, Bobby Kennedy started off working for Joe McCarthy. Hugo Black started off when he ran for office, had the endorsement of the KKK. It's not the endorsement, the support of the KKK. Al Gore Sr. Voted against the Civil Rights Act, stood up to Strom Thurmond, and then voted against the Civil Rights Act, but lost his seat knowing he might by standing up to Richard Nixon on the war and on race. So they all were mostly courageous, but they were all uneven, as all human beings are and all elected officials are. But so I tried to bring out, I think my wife's exhortation to write essays was really in part to reflect, to sort of shine a more human spotlight on their failures and their blemishes, in addition to celebrating the greatness of some of them.
So you mentioned him before, but Glenn Taylor, the senator from Idaho, I believe served from 1945 to 1951. He is a character of American history that I have to admit, I had no idea who he was. And yet by the time it was done, I wanted to know more. So can you tell folks a little bit about Glenn Taylor, what drew you to him?
Yeah, Glenn Taylor had a one-loss record, I believe, of 1-6 or 1-7. He started off as a singer. He and his wife's name was Dora. Glenn and Dora Taylor started the Glenn Dora Singers in Idaho, traveling around with their little boy named, their boy's name, their first child, was Dora in reverse, named A-Rod, like the baseball player. A-Rod would sing, and Glenn and Dora would play and sing, and they went on the road. And he came across a guy running for governor that he thought wasn't as good as he was in terms of making a speech. And so he ran, he lost, he ran, he lost. Finally, he wins the Senate seat in 1944. His third year in the Senate, he took on this on the first day of the Senate, the beginning of the Senate opening that day, took on the most racist member of the Senate, maybe the most racist in the 20th century, a guy named Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi, who was sick with cancer, and Glenn Taylor took him on and kept him from being seated. He later died before being seated. And Glenn Taylor then went on to be Henry Wallace's running mate for president. And Wallace with the Progressive Party, Glenn Taylor, in the best part of the chapter, and maybe the most fun part of the book to understand and discover and understand, was Glenn Taylor, when he was a running mate for Henry Wallace, campaigned in Birmingham, Alabama, and he spoke to an integrated audience, planning to poke the bear, if you will. He ended up spending the night in the Birmingham jail. And as his son pointed out, I reached A-Rod on the phone. I'm not that good with internet research, but I found A-Rod at that point, a retired dentist in his mid-70s. I called him up. He was suspicious at first. What was I doing researching his father? And it turns out, and A-Rod said to me, my dad was in the Birmingham jail, thrown into jail by Bull Connor, and he was there when Dr. King was still in high school. Obviously suggesting the later to come, the letter from the Birmingham jail, one of the most famous missives ever written in American history.
I thought that Glenn Taylor was a really interesting story for this moment when we're wrestling with our country's complicated and sometimes ugly racist history. And we talk a lot about these revered historical figures who were flawed and racist. And often as we talk about them, we say, well, gosh, everyone at the time had the same racist views. Everyone at the time, did these racist things, and they should get a pass. But Glenn Taylor was somebody who was from, as you note, a nearly all-white state, who took on racism, who took on racial segregation when they weren't politically expedient things to do. And so I'm interested in how reading about Glenn Taylor and thinking about his story kind of helps shape your views now as you think about the questions that we're wrestling with of, should we still honor these people from our past? Should we take down statues? Should we give these people from our history a pass for their racist views?
Yeah, I don't think you should. I think you put it in context, you understand. I wrote about Hugo Black, who started as a member of the Klan and later his image was burned in effigy at his law school after he was one of the writers of the Brown v. Board of Education. And I think that we all wrestle with that. We wrestle with how much do we honor these people that deserve it, or maybe they don't deserve it. I write my first chapter after Hugo Black. I start that essay by saying, like Hugo Black, my mother was a child of the segregated South. My mom used to tell me during the era, and many of you watching this maybe aren't old enough to remember this, including Colleen and Mike, I think, that when forced busing was a big political issue in this country in the 60s and early 70s. And my mom once said to me, she said, I remember forced busing in my little town in Georgia where the black kids were bused in a rickety old bus past the new white schoolhouse to go to an inferior black school that maybe had enough books and maybe didn't. And so I wanted, rather than judging the past, the early careers of some, I guess I would like to talk about their evolution and celebrate those that were courageous. Theodore Green was courageous. Some of these were really courageous from the start. Really, all 8 of them kind of got that way. Perhaps it's after you've been in public office a while, you maybe give up your interest or your dreams to be president. There's an old saying that a secret ballot was taken in the U.S. Senate on who should be the next president. And it was a 100-way tie for first. So, but I think, like Al Gore Sr. clearly had put presidential aspirations behind him, and he got more courageous his last term, probably knowing, I don't think he didn't want it to be his last term, but probably knowing that he could pay a price for that. So I guess if I judge, I try not to judge, but if I judge based on the courage they showed at some point in their careers.
So in the prologue to the book, you write about 3 progressive eras, or what you call the 3 progressive eras. And if I have the timeline right, the first one roughly coincides with the Wilson presidency, so it's probably 1912 to 21. The second you identify as 1933 to 1938, so that would have been in kind of the meat of the Roosevelt presidency. and then the third in the mid 1960s during the Johnson presidency. So that just sort of got my wheels turning as I read the rest of the book, because it asks these questions. So why, if we think of the whole breadth of American history, those are three relatively short periods, these kind of short bursts where a lot of this progressive legislation took place. And it made me kind of wonder, why does progressive legislating happen, or these big progressive victories happen in these short spurts? What causes them to start? What causes them to stop? And then obviously there's a question too, which is, after this election, do you think we might be on the cusp of another one of these? But maybe we don't have to get to that quite yet. But why these short, intense bursts of major progressive legislative accomplishments?
Well, that's the hardest question to answer, perhaps, in any survey of American politics and progressivism. And I would argue too, there was a bit of a stillborn progressive era from 2008 that got cut so short for a whole bunch of reasons we can go into or not. And I also do think that we very, very well are on the cusp of a new progressive era. I think it's I am not enough of a PhD in his history, perhaps, to go deep enough, but I think there's a burst of energy that coming out of darkness with Roosevelt, out of the Depression, with Johnson coming out of the protest and the beating up of African Americans and so much worse, leading into civil rights. And I think that progressives, when they're in charge, move quickly, do big things. The great thing about these progressive eras is that their victories, their accomplishments are durable. They last for decades. I mean, FDR, the collective bargaining, minimum wage, 8-hour workday, rural electrification, Social Security, LBJ, Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights, voting rights, Equal Opportunity Act, Higher Ed Act, Wilderness Act, immigration reform made us a much more diverse country. All of those things last, if they serve the nation for decades. I just think Emerson said there's a battle between, history is a battle between conservators and innovators. Conservators, today's conservatives, innovators, today's progressives. The problem for people with my political views, progressives, is that we always, the forces that unleash against us are so well funded and so powerful. There is and that's they have come back so strong with so much money, and I don't know that progressives have been as ready as we should have been at the end of each era. But maybe society can only have a burst of progressivism for a certain period of time, and then people retrench. They retrench, usually saying stop, as George Will says, stop, enough, no. But they don't peel back. The society still benefits from these. You could argue this time with Obama, they've continued to try to peel back on the Affordable Care Act and on Dodd-Frank. That's why I say this one, the Obama 2 years was not a particular progressive era, because it never really got the accomplishments rooted in society the way that LBJ did and the way that Franklin Roosevelt did.
So your book is obviously makes a really forceful case for progressive ideas. And I know that you've said that the stories of these senators show that America's at its best during progressive eras. And you just laid out a long list of high impact accomplishments by progressives. But I wondered whether, conversely, you think there are any conservative eras in our country's history that you would point to as successful or ultimately good for the country.
Well, I think that that's I don't know what to say with that one, Colleen. I think that, I mean, there needs to be a tension of progressives and conservatives. I mean, that's what Emerson was talking about, and you need that tension, and you need pushback from time to time. But I guess I conflate today conservative with special interest money in many ways. I mean, there is no conservative party in the United States of America today. There's the Trump party, which is all about tax cuts and judges that are anti-labor and want to take women's rights away and civil rights. I mean, the reason people like George Will don't like Donald Trump and don't like what the Republican Party has become is there is no conservative party in this country. There's a progressive party, and there's a reactionary serving the interests of the wealthy party. I mean, I think that the conservatives do not always have to just serve the wealthy. Typically they have, because wealthy interest groups take over the Conservative Party generally. But I mean, I do think that there have been good eras that weren't progressive, but so often so much was left out. The Eisenhower years were great if you look like me for much of America, but they're not so great. They weren't so great for women. They especially weren't so great for African Americans. So I think we err in romanticizing history generally, although I guess I've done it some, but because when I think of romanticizing the past, I think that in the 1950s and early 60s, 95 white men and 1 white woman couldn't pass civil rights. And we had 15% of our country that weren't really full citizens. So that's why I don't romanticize the past generally.
So another one of the senators that you profiled, William Proxmeyer, senator from Wisconsin, who served, I guess, at the end of the sort of Eisenhower era for a long time, from 1957 to 1988. I thought he was an interesting inclusion, right? So he was born into great privilege. I believe he married a Rockefeller. He was a candidate many, many times, I think, before actually meeting with success. He wrote a self-help book, and he talked about he got a hair transplant and chatted about that as well. And as you write on page 204, he was selected by Washington insiders as America's least effective senator. So it doesn't seem to be the likeliest candidate to be included with some folks like, Bobby Kennedy and Al Gore Sr. and George McGovern. So what got him included in this story? What drew him to you?
First, he is such an interesting character. He was in the Senate a long time. You're right. He was 0-3. He ran for 3 times and lost. And then he had Joe McCarthy's seat, which made him such a contrast. After McCarthy's death, he won the special election. He got more effective as he was there. He was chair. He was also chair of the committee that I will, knock on wood, chair if the Democrats win the Senate. That's the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. That piqued my interest. But he did a lot of he really did stand up for the quote unquote, again, little guy. He just had a peculiar way of doing it. He was a loner. He wasn't particularly liked. LBJ particularly disliked him, at least pretty soon after he got there. There's nobody like him in terms of somebody who so threw himself into the Senate that he had not much, almost no other life. He when he'd run for re-election after he was successful a couple of times, he'd run for re-election. He spent almost no money. He'd spend $200, and that was for stamps to mail back checks of people that had sent him unsolicited, sent him checks. But what he did was he would go home every single weekend, and he would shake hands. He would go. I have heard stories from a later senator told me that he came out of a Milwaukee Braves back then, Milwaukee Braves game, and Bill Proxmeyer standing outside on a Tuesday night shaking hands. Another time, this same senator, Herb Kohl, told me on Easter Sunday. Now, Herb's Jewish, so Easter Sunday's a different holiday. Bill Proxmeyer was eating at a restaurant in Racine, Wisconsin, and Bill Proxmeyer was working tables, saying hi to everybody on Easter Sunday. I mean, Proxmeyer never quit. And it's why he had easy races. It's why he probably didn't have an easy time of it personally. And I'll just conclude this little monologue with Tom Harkin, senator from Iowa. Many of you know that name. Harkin was in the Senate for 30 years. Harkin went to see Proxmeyer 2 years before, as Proxmeyer was leaving. Harkin was beginning the first re-election, so year 5 of his term. And Harkin said to Proxmeyer, he said, "Can I come in your office and talk to you?" And Proxmeyer said, "Yeah." And he sits down and he says, "So how do you win elections the way you do? What do you got to do? Give me some advice." And Proxmeyer looked at Harkin and said, "You don't want to live the way I've lived the last 20 years. So there are some lessons there. So Proxmeyer taught me something too. But he had his moments of greatness.
You touched briefly on Hugo Black from Alabama, and I didn't want to move on without circling back to him for at least a minute longer. You mentioned that he joined the KKK because he thought it would help him politically. He said later, "I would have joined any group if it helped me get votes," which I guess is honest. But he eventually resigned from the Klan. He apologized. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about his story, and also just his apology and his revisiting of his views. I wondered whether you think in today's politics, whether it's just become untenable to ever admit that you are wrong, to ever apologize or to rethink an issue.
I was going to say it's untenable to have joined the Klan and win an election day, or at least it should be. Whether an apology, I mean, plenty of us apologize for things. I mean, not the President of the United States, he doesn't, but I think plenty of us have apologized for mistakes we've made, votes we've cast, personal things maybe we've done. But Black was Black. He renounced the Klan, but he really didn't get a whole lot better in civil rights until his reelection. Then he became probably the greatest, next to Robert Wagner of New York. He became the greatest advocate. He did not use the term that I could find, dignity of work, that I use, or that Dr. King used, or that Pope Leo XIII used, the labor pope 130 years ago. But he was really all about empowering workers. And so he really helped to write the law that created the middle class. I think you can undisputedly say the empowering of the creation and empowering of the labor movement in the 30s created the middle class, especially after World War II. You could just see as productivity for workers went up, wages went up because of the high rate of unionization. There's definitely a lesson in that. And you can see now as productivity, not during the pandemic, but productivity continues to rise for worker productivity. You see profits rising comparably, commensurately. You see executive compensation rising faster. You see workers' wages flat, again because of the dilution of union power. The fact that not very many people have a union representing them to get their wages higher. To in a sense, Sharon. I mean, to me, the union movement, the dignity of work, is workers sharing the wealth they create for their employer. And you don't see very much of that today. That's why the huge inequality gap, I think.
I've been reminded by Denisha, our roving reporter, for those people who'd like to add in questions, please, for those that are watching this on Facebook, you can add the questions below. And for those that are watching it via Zoom in the chat function, they will pop up and we will make sure to share them. So sort of building off Colleen's point there, starting with Hugo Black, it was perhaps the most difficult one to sort of work through because, yes, Klan membership, leading the filibuster of an anti-lynching bill, and then authoring the Korematsu case that, ruled constitutional the internment of Japanese American citizens. But even as you mentioned earlier, some of the other folks that you profiled, Al Gore Sr. voting against the Civil Rights Act, Bobby Kennedy. This is actually something I had no idea that Bobby Kennedy had bugged Martin Luther King's phone. Was a bit of American history that I hadn't heard before. But one of the questions and as you mentioned, the essays that you intersperse between your sort of historical analysis of these folks and your own viewpoint from your vantage point of Desk 88, it's sort of this question of like, who do we owe nuance to? Because from some of your essays, I mean, you train your sights on a few folks, Alan Greenspan, John Boehner, Joe Lieberman. And it's kind of, for me, at least as a reader, it was a bit of a jump from saying, well, we need to look at these other folks and the totality of what they've done. And they made some mistakes and they did some good things. And then it was just kind of hammer and tongs at old Alan Greenspan. So I wonder, it's like, do we owe the same nuance to people who disagree with us than with the people that ultimately were on our side? How do we navigate that?
I've not thought of that way. I guess I am kind of hard on Greenspan. I think he did great damage to this country in terms of what he did to the middle class and to workers, and encouraging companies to shut down in Kansas City or Independence or Wichita and move over, or Cleveland and move overseas. I served with Lieberman, so I come to that one honestly, and I forget who was the third one. Lieberman.
The list is reasonably long. I think
okay,
Boehner was in there. There may be some others.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, that's a really good point. Maybe if I agree. I mean, I don't pretend to be a fair-minded editorial writer at the Kansas City Star. I don't pretend to be neutral on all things politics. So I brought my opinion into things, and I guess I think it's partly do these politicians, and I mean, Greenspan's a politician in that sense too, elected or not. Do these politicians near the end, later in their career, get better, apologize, have some contrition about the damage that any of us might have done? I think all 8 of these senators did. I'm struggling to answer this in the most logical way I can, but I'm thinking out loud here. I think that some of the other characters did not. I mean, Greenspan kind of did a little bit once, saying that the mortgage, the terrible. I live in Cleveland. My wife and I live in Cleveland. Our zip code had more foreclosures than any zip code in the United States, 44105 in 2007. And Alan Greenspan was entirely at fault for that. But Alan Greenspan and a lot of Wall Street people never paid any real price for the damage they did to my neighborhood and to a whole bunch of people that don't have the privilege I do, that you can still see the desolation in parts of my neighborhood where people lost their homes. I don't see the people there anymore, but the desolation's there. And so I guess maybe I'd come down there. What are they doing late in life to either make up for it, show contrition, apologize, or even discuss it? Instead, some of them turn into well-paid lobbyists.
I wanted to ask you about Herbert Lehman, who you mentioned briefly. I didn't know much about him. He was governor and then senator from New York. But you wrote that he often tilted at windmills, and then he introduced legislation that he knew wouldn't pass, but he thought it was important to kind of put it in the public record. And I'm curious how you view his approach and also the approach of some of your present day colleagues in Congress, as you kind of wrestle with the question of, should I try to get something done, get something passed, even if that means compromising, or should I, as Lehman did, tilt at windmills, but put it in the public record? And two examples in this moment, obviously Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, those aren't in any danger of passing Congress anytime soon, but their sponsors, their advocates have succeeded in making these proposals part of the political conversation. So I'm interested in your thoughts about Lehman and just kind of that approach.
Yeah, Lehman, that's interesting that's your interpretation, because I think you're generally right. Lehman was a very effective governor. He succeeded Roosevelt. He was lieutenant governor under Roosevelt, became governor, was very effective. He was the pusher behind the Little New Deal in New York. It was easier in the New York legislature than it was in the U.S. Congress, probably. I think history says that, to enact some of those things, but Lehman really did that. So he was an efficient, effective administrator. When he went to the Senate later in life, he was a guy that his family had plenty of money. He had plenty of money. He didn't worry about any of that. But I think he felt so strongly about civil rights that he just kept going on trying to move on civil rights. And I think the description you do, the label you give him, Colleen, that he tilted windmills, is probably pretty accurate. But I think he knew that. I think he just thought civil rights is such a fundamental issue of humanity and rightness and justice that he would just keep doing it. And he was made fun of. He took on McCarthy too, and he was made. So on the real issues of justice, you often lose. But I also think that even the Medicare for All, I thought about running for president a year and a half ago and did or 2 years ago, and not really had planned to think about that in my life. I mean, it wasn't part of my life's plan ever. But I very explicitly said I don't support Medicare for All, but I did support Medicare at 55, giving people the option. I think that the Medicare for All probably advanced the issue some, but I also knew that Medicare at 55 was doable. I think there's a reasonably good chance that Biden will pass the public option bill written by Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island and me from 10 years ago. I think that we will very likely see a public option or a Medicare at 55 optional for a 58-year-old that loses her job when her business closes or the plant shuts down. But I think people that have talked about this have blazed that trail. I mean, I started on Medicare at 55. I introduced that bill in 1999 with Senator Moynihan. I was in the House, he was in the Senate, and Senator Kennedy. And its time has come. I think its time had come 10 years ago, but we fell literally a vote short. And that vote, Mike will be glad to know, was Joe Lieberman, just to bring up and beat that dead horse again, if I could.
It looks like Denisha has a question from one of our viewers.
Okay, cool.
I do. So as a delegate in 1972 for George McGovern, I remain a person who deeply appreciates his work and courage. What do you still celebrate from his career, both during his time in the Senate and after? From David Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you for that. certainly a fondness for McGovern just from knowing him. And he had a humility to him that was not a common trait in the U.S. Senate, I would say. He cared about he really cared about people that didn't have an opportunity in life. And he was what he took out of his public service, I think, more than anything, is he told a story before he was in the Senate when he represented President Kennedy and had worked on hunger programs, which he later did with Bob Dole in the Senate. And he met Pope John the 23rd, and John the 23rd said, when you meet your maker and he asked, did you feed the hungry, you can say yes, Mr. McGovern. And that's the one lesson. The other thing I took out of it in a maybe more human way is in probably 2008, freshman senators take turns presiding over the Senate. And I was up there one day presiding over a mostly empty Senate chamber. And there are sitting below you on the steps, below the presiding officer's chair, are pages, 16, 17-year-old boys and girls, not yet young men and women. And George McGovern walked in the back door of the Senate, the back double doors. And I said to them, do you know who that is? And nobody knew who he was. And I said, his name's George McGovern. And they still didn't know who he was. So there is some Marcus Aurelius, fame is fleeting, and we all return dust to dust, and all those metaphors, all those cliches. But I learned that from how quickly we're all forgotten in that way.
So there's a fascinating story, and I believe it's Senator Lehman. Well, one of the things that you mentioned a couple times throughout the book is you speak about the age of senators. And you put in several different points talking about the average age of senators and the kind of increasing average age of senators. And you tell the story, I believe was it Senator Lehman that they got him to resign from his committee? It was then Senator Johnson.
No,
got him
it was T.F. Green. It was Senator
T.F.
Green.
Green. Forgive me.
Yeah.
Could you tell that story? Because I think it's a really interesting one. And does that tell us anything as we look to political leadership? That, I mean, both of our presidential candidates are in their 70s. A lot of leadership on both sides of the aisle that we see are sort of getting up there in years. Do you worry about that? Do you think about that? Do you think these folks have lessons for us about that?
Well, we all think about that. I think most human beings think about as you reach the age of 50, 55, 60, 65, you start thinking a bit about mortality. I remember as a kid, I'm a big Cleveland Indians baseball fan, which is difficult in life to be sentenced to that. And I know the Royals and the Indians are in the same division, but the Royals, anyway. But I remember watching on TV, it's probably an old black and white, of Willie Mays, maybe the greatest player of all time, certainly the greatest center fielder, the most beautifully coordinated and gazelle-like playing center field. And I remember in watching him, and two things happened, and I don't remember if it was the same game or not. He tripped going around second base once, and he fell down going after a fly ball once. And I remember thinking, I hope I play in the major leagues, but that didn't happen. But second, I just remember thinking as a kid, I guess people need to know when to quit. And Willie Mays probably played one more year than he should have. It doesn't mean he doesn't go down great, and most people don't remember the trip or the fall. But I hope that I have the sense to do that when I'm age whatever in the U.S. Senate. Theodore Green stayed too long. He came at 69, if you recall, so he wasn't there. He was there, 89. He was there. He was in his beginning of his fourth term. I think so, yeah. And he, or into his fourth term, and he couldn't preside over the committee, and he wasn't really all there. You know, it's pretty sad. And LBJ handled it the way you'd expect LBJ, with bravado and not gently and not as kindly as he should have. And but I've nothing I came across would say anything other than T.F. Green was a decent, honorable, moral character, guy who just stayed too long.
You mentioned thinking at least a little bit about running for president, and before I came back home to Kansas, I covered the last two presidential campaigns when I was in DC, and I traveled with Hillary Clinton in 2016. And so I was on the trail with her a couple times when she was in Ohio and you were with her. And a lot of voters in Ohio told me how much they wish that you would run for president. And I saw that a reviewer noted that the agenda that you lay out in this book really resembles a party platform potentially for the 2020 convention. And I wondered how you're thinking about maybe running for president aligned with what you wrote in this book, and whether there were thoughts that that this would kind of be a roadmap for the party or a roadmap for a future presidential campaign.
It's not a roadmap for anything. I wrote it. I really never considered seriously running for president until after the 2018 election, when I just began to think about it. I mean, I never believe politicians when they say lots of people came to me and asked me to run for president. No, really, it's your idea. I mean, not that some don't, but so I don't mean no false humility here, but that's kind of the way it is. And this message of dignity of work has been my whole career. I didn't use the term. The term is more recently acquired, if you will, in the last few years. Again, not my term, Dr. King's, and before that, it was Pope Leo the 13th, as far as I can tell. In the end, you've got to really, really, really want to be president. And I don't really, really, really want to be president. I don't want to put my family through or go through what you have to do. I love the Senate. I could stay here. I hope at least one more term. I win in a state that's not easy for a Democrat, but as my wife's book publisher said, no whining on the yacht. If you get a job like this, you don't complain about it or how you got it or how hard it is or anything. Nobody wants to hear that. So I thought about it. I think that the Joe Biden message, I look at Biden is running as the real dignity of work philosophy candidate. I see next door to you and across in Kansas, Barbara Poirier is running for the Senate with the same kind of dignity of work contrasted with a betrayal of workers, which I think this president has done. And the Republican sycophantic, spineless Republican Senate has gone along. Something I think history, if somebody writes a book about the Trump years, of course, someone will, many people will. The one of the most telling stories is the spinelessness of damn near every Republican elected official in the country. And they're going to look really, really bad to history. But as you can see from Ben Sass's comments, not that it changed any of his votes, if he was overheard saying some very negative things about Trump that most of my colleagues, maybe Ted Cruz you brought up, might not think that. I don't know what he thinks, but anyway, I drifted a little bit there. But you've just got to really want to be president, and I think that it's an uncommon ambition in a human being. I don't look down on anybody that wants to be or that works at it. But I also just thought in the end it wasn't for me. But I'm working very hard to elect a new president with Joe Biden. So,
Denisha, it looks like we have another question.
Yes, we do. How has bipartisanship historically interacted with progressivism? Can you share some examples of historic bipartisan relationships?
Oh yeah, the part of the problem today is in the night. Let's look at civil rights, Ms. Snell. In the 60s, the Democratic Party was very split. You had the Herbert Lehmans. I mean, he had just retired, but you had the Hubert Humphrey, Herbert Lehman, the Kennedys eventually. In the same parties, you had Richard Russell and the segregationist Southerners, the same political party. The North the Republicans were split too. You had Westerners who were generally, and Midwesterners who were generally more conservative, and you had Northeastern Republicans like Case and Brooke and Rockefeller and Javits and Pearson. Well, Pearson from Kansas was a pretty progressive Republican too, but they were mostly in the Northeast. And so you could have a bipartisan civil rights movement, if you call it that, in the Senate. In the House, you had there's a very conservative Republican from Ohio who was the ranking Republican on the Judiciary Committee in the House, and he was a big player in the civil rights and nothing else progressive but civil rights. So people would cry, but the parties now are so ideologically aligned. I mean, there are no really conservative Democrats anymore. There are a few moderate Democrats, progressive Democrats. There are really, frankly, no moderate Republicans in the U.S. Senate, with the exception maybe of Susan Collins, and she's about to leave. in my opinion, and Lisa Murkowski, whose office is right two doors away from me right here. But that's what one thing that makes bipartisanship so hard is there's not much ideological cross fertilization, if you will, and the American public's so divided. So blame all of us, but each party is sort of self-selected, not the regional difference. I mean, Southern Democrats are more conservative than Northern Democrats, and Northern Republicans might be a little more moderate than Southern Republicans, but not much.
You know, one of the things that happened during the primary campaign, which feels like a lifetime ago, I can only imagine for everyone that's there, but especially for younger people, at least one of those sort of boomlets that happened came around Andrew Yang, that he had, I think, at least a few weeks where he was certainly popular. And one of his big arguments was this idea of a universal basic income. I'm interested, you as someone who has talked about the dignity of work, that's talked about workers, how do you think about that? Like, is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? Is it irrelevant to the questions that were happening? But what do you think about it?
I think it's a somewhat of a good idea. I was a little disappointed. I mean, I don't know Andrew Yang. I know most of the candidates. I didn't know him, and I didn't know much about him. I was intrigued by his idea. It would have been good for the process if his idea had gotten more play, but with 20 candidates and he was out of the race, kind of like that, like most of them were, that didn't really get into the discussion. I wish it had. There are ways of doing it. There is the unemployment benefit that, there are ways of addressing it peripherally or maybe more centrally. You do the child tax credit for everybody with kids under a certain income. That's my bill. I've worked with Senator Bennett and Senator Booker on it, Bennett of Colorado, Booker of New Jersey and we've got a lot of support. It's pretty much universally supported by Democrats. It really comes out of, Ronald Reagan liked something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is often linked to the child tax credit. So that is sometimes something a little bit like Yang has proposed. It's been around for some time. And as I said, there's unemployment benefit. To me, the most criminal is not the right word. The most awful thing that Republicans have done this year is take away the $600 a week benefit that kept millions out of poverty. There's a study when Congress passed in March the CARES Act. One of the things we passed included $600 a week unemployment benefit for unemployed Americans. By August, McConnell refused to renew it. A study showed that 12 million people were kept out of poverty because of that $600 a week for people who couldn't find jobs. McConnell and Trump let it expire in August. I was talking last night to a group of Barbara Boyer supporters, and they all supported that, and her opponent doesn't. That's the fault line in American politics today. And hundreds of thousands of people every day are dropping into poverty. If that's not a clear lesson yet, we're probably McConnell's called us back this week. I'm in my DC office now, and we will almost certainly vote on a Supreme Court justice. And McConnell doesn't have time to pass the $600 a week benefit that would keep millions of Americans out of poverty. It's almost certain that there will be a wave of evictions coming in the next few weeks because the Senate, the spineless Senate, refused to move. Because the president didn't tell him to move.
Denisha, I think we got another question.
We do. We have another one from our audience. When in your political life did you encounter the willingness among voters that we see today to sublimate their conscience and good sense in order to vocally support someone with abhorrent views? Or is our current moment anomalous outside of McCarthyism? And this viewer says that they are also a Cleveland fan and stand in solidarity with you, and don't tell her Kansas City friends.
I don't really know how to answer that. I assume it's an allusion or a direct reference to Trump. I stand amazed. I understand fairly well because Trump carried my state by 8 points, why Trump won. I think that voters, they saw a business guy they thought was successful. We really kind of know better. Now they saw somebody who, they saw politicians coming in and promising year after year after year to protect their jobs and stop jobs from moving overseas. Trump said he would do that. They thought they'd take a chance on him. I mean, so people voted for him. Well, I think now we know he's a racist. We know he's a misogynist. We know he's dishonest. We know he's not a successful businessman. So to explain this away with the American voters is a difficult thing for me. I watch these rallies sometimes. I see the people behind cheering him when he doesn't care about them at all. And if you needed any evidence of that, look what he did when he walked into the White House and took his mask off and was willing to expose the valets and the Secret Service and the cooks and the dozens and dozens and dozens of people that work in the White House that need their jobs to feed their families, and probably went home those nights wondering if they had infected their family. And the president just didn't seem to care. So I don't pretend to understand American politics as well as I used to think I did, or think I used to, or something.
So I saw that in an interview late last year, you said that researching this book actually gave you reason for optimism, and that even though you viewed Trump as a terrible president, the project provided you a reminder that our country has endured much worse in the past. You said all of that late last year. A lot has transpired since then. That was pre-COVID, that was pre-George Floyd, that was pre-Trump in campaign mode. We now find ourselves, as you were just discussing, in a pretty dark moment. So I wanted to ask you the same question that an interviewer asked you nearly a year ago, and ask you whether you're as optimistic today about this country's resilience and the durability of our institutions.
I am, but I appreciate your saying that was before the pandemic that I said that, because I did say in interviews then, in thinking about the book, this is not the worst time. The people that hate Trump, and that's, you know, a large number of people, whether it's 40 or 45 or 50 or 55%, whatever it is, the people that really, really dislike him have said for years, this is the worst time in our history. And I don't really buy that. I didn't think it was the worst time in our history until the pandemic. I think now you maybe can make the case. Certainly the worst time in my lifetime, my sentient lifetime that I remember for our country. It's may not be worse than the Depression. It may be. Maybe not worse than World War II. It may be, depending on how I guess you define that. But I still, even with that, I think we're a resilient people. I think the voters are going to change the course of this country again. And so the last chapter of the book, which was written, I turned into the publisher, I think in August. I started writing it in April for the paper. They told me a paperback would come out in November or in September, and I needed to write another chapter. And I kept writing and rewriting because I started writing it with no pandemic, and then I saw how long it was and all that. But the chapter title was if I recall, "And Still, Hope," because I think we're resilient. I think we figure it out. I think the next president and the Senate and the House will listen to the scientists. I mean, imagine if the president of the United States had told the truth in January or February about this virus. He had leveled with the American people, had worn a mask himself, he had told his supporters and his detractors to wear a mask, had talked about social distancing. We could be Korea in terms of its dealings. So South Korea and the United States each had about 90 deaths in March. By March, we each had about 90 deaths. I think Korea has lost 300 people, and their unemployment rate's under 4%. Because they took it seriously. The Kansas City doctors aren't worse than Korean doctors, but Kansas City's president and Cleveland's president is worse than the leaders in Korea. And that fundamentally is what happened. So it's not all about leadership, but a lot of it's that. And it's about, I guess I partly take out of the people I hadn't thought of this until we started talking, but people that I really admired of these 8 senators and the people around them were those that practiced humility. And humility in leadership is not common in any country, perhaps is not common where I work, but is really an important factor in realizing your own, maybe those pages saying they didn't know who George McGovern was taught me a little humility too, that we didn't know. We all have our places in the world, and my favorite part of the Bible, Matthew 25, which you all probably know, but I'm going to give a little different translation. When I was hungry, Jesus said, "When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. What you did for the least of these, you did for me." And I never believed that Jesus or Muhammad or or Buddha would have called anybody less than somebody else. And I came across a different translation of the Bible. I was talking to a pastor friend of mine today. When I was hungry, you fed me, and I was thirsty, you gave me drink. What you did for those who seemed less important, not what you did for the least of these, what you did for those who seemed less important. Because in the eyes of God, we don't one outrank the other as I'm forgetting the poet who said that. But anyway, I'll just close with that.
Well, friends, the book was Desk 88, 8 Progressive Senators Who Changed America. Senator Brown, thank you so much. Colleen, thank you so much. I'm going to throw it over to Denisha to wrap it up for us.
Thank you. It was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Brown, for joining us tonight. And thank you to our moderators, Colleen and Mike. I'd also like to thank those of you who attended this evening. Please join us again this Thursday as we explore gun violence in Missouri with the Kansas City Star. And on October 27th with our distinguished guest, Thomas Neal from the Library of Congress. We'll be examining the Electoral College. At the conclusion of this event, you will be directed to a short post-event survey. Please take a few moments to complete. This information helps us improve our events and lets us know what kind of programs our supporters want to see. Finally, if you enjoyed this program this evening and believe that conversations like this are important, please consider becoming a member of American Public Square. Our members help support our programs and allow us to continue providing space for civil, fact-based discussion. You can learn more about membership by visiting our website, americanpublicsquare.org. Once again, thank you for joining us and have a good evening. Cheers. See you soon.